Hi, and welcome to this edition of the NGINX Community Chats. During our chat, you're going to hear about some things open sourcey, meet some of the people behind open source, both inside and outside of NGINX and F5, and maybe even learn something new. I'm Dave McAllister. I'm open source technologist here for F5 and NGINX. And today we're getting into the bits and bytes of a project with Fabrizio Fiorucci. Thanks for joining us today, Fabrizio. What do you do here at F5?
Hi, Dave. Thank you for having me today. So I've been with F5 for quite a while. It has been 17 years. I used to be a solution engineer focusing on pre-sales for the Italian market, and then I moved on to becoming a solution architect, covering and supporting the EMEA business for NGINX, for everything NGINX. So I'm really into that.
I have to admit that I'm impressed. The longest place I've ever stayed anywhere was 10 years. And then I have to admit that I tend to get bored easily. So it's kind of nice to hear that you've changed over time as well, because anybody working 17 years on the exact same thing every time would be like, oh my gosh, you must know it better than anyone else in the world. So.
Well, actually, the story with NGINX was quite interesting because when back in the days when F5 acquired NGINX, I happened to be, let's say, an open source user for quite a while for my own projects. So that was kind of a new world to keep on exploring. That was really interesting, and this is where we are.
That actually leads to an interesting question. You obviously have a background in open source prior to this, and you've been working on an open source. But what's it like working on open source projects here at NGINX?
So NGINX, as we all know, originates from the open source scene and culture. So it implies the fact that working on collateral OSS projects is kind of part of being in the NGINX ecosystem, let's say. So within my daily duties, let's say at F5 and NGINX, building and contributing, producing and developing open source bits and pieces is part of the way we support our customers, a part of the way we make NGINX better, trying to come up with ideas that can be discussed internally. And there is a high degree of cross collaboration across different teams. And that's something that really motivates everyone trying to make things better and trying to come up with new ideas.
You're, by the way, I've also gone through, you're obviously a really prolific blogger and you've got some really great technical stuff. It's a hint to the audience to go check it out. But one of the projects that you've been working on is this declarative API for NGINX. And it's kind of interesting because we also have things that, we have a Kubernetes gateway API, but we have API gateways. So what is this declarative API for NGINX all about?
So when NGINX started back in the days, it basically became 20 years old a couple of months ago, if I'm not mistaken. NGINX was mainly focusing on the data plane component. So the way to configure it was basically creating a text file, which is okay. But for real world deployment, then you need to have tools that allow you to easily manage configuration lifecycle in a real world deployment, whether it is a large customer or my lab in the basement. So at the end of the day, the control plane becomes really important. Out of the box, NGINX comes with its own control plane. And the idea I came up with 2 or 3 years ago was starting to work on an open source project just for fun, trying to see if I could add another layer on top of that, trying to make configuration simpler. And I motivated the idea from what we still have in the big IP world, which is AS3, which is the declarative framework for big IP automation and orchestration. So I told myself, why can't I try and build something similar for NGINX as well? So the idea is to have a GitHub repo written in Python that allows you to focus on telling what you need to achieve with NGINX instead of focusing on how to build the configuration. So rather than saying, I need to write a configuration file for NGINX, I focus on describing my desired outcome, feed this type of input into the declarative API, and then automatically the NGINX configuration is then built and deployed.
Wow. That is, so you threw out so many wild terms there. So my background, I'm an SRE DevOps background. I'm deep into the monitoring category and tend to get involved with that. But automation is where the name of the game is these days. And so, where can this help people in terms of saving times? Why should they really care about this?
So in terms of automation, the aim of the game is trying to get application deployed, application published, secured, and so forth.
Okay.
So in general, one would want to invest their time in focusing on their business and application needs rather than learning all the related jargon. I mean, if one is familiar with the NGINX configuration, that's absolutely amazing and brilliant, and there is a vast community doing that. But when I started designing this project, I started from the assumption that one might know NGINX as a de facto standard and powerful tool to do pretty much everything in the modern
Right.
apps world without needing to learn how to actually configure it. So I want to use a tool. I want to drive a car. I have a driving license, but I have no idea how the engine of the car works. I shouldn't need to know. So it's enough for me to get a driving license. So in some sense, the declarative API might be compared to the driving license that allows me to drive the car without knowing the bits and pieces on how it works under the hood. So that's pretty much what I try to put together.
Nice. Nice. That's actually interesting. In our community, it's probably the number one series of questions are all around configuration problems. And this approach is different enough from saying, "Oh, you already know all the bits and bytes, and therefore you know what to do," rather than saying, "Oh, okay, this is my desired outcome, and let's figure it out from there." So that's actually really, really powerful. Also, if I remember correctly, doing the 30,000, this is an open source project, but where is it? Where can we find it?
So it sits on the F5 The Central GitHub space. So it's github.com/F5 The Central/nginx minus declarative minus API. It's open, it's free, just a matter of cloning it and using it. It's Python code, 100% Python code. And the way I envisioned this project was providing the ability to run it on a virtual machine, on Docker, on Kubernetes, in order to make it as flexible as possible. As you correctly pointed out, automation is critical these days, and automation implies the fact of being infrastructure agnostic. So we might have an environment where OpenShift is the norm, or Kubernetes, or Docker, or any other type of technology. So having tools like NGINX that you can deploy really wherever you need to run them is a big plus. So I try to follow the same baseline. Another interesting topic is working with a source of truth, like a Git repository. So using the declarative API, it is possible to memorize, to store some objects like certificates and keys and security policies and configuration snippets and JavaScript functions on a random GitHub repo or GitLab repo. And then the declarative API can fetch all the building blocks from around the infrastructure, put them together, create the target NGINX configuration, and deploy that. That as the aim of trying to make things simpler, worrying about the business aspect of things without caring too much, again, about the NGINX jargon.
Cool. That's fascinating. So, repeating back real quickly, this is on github.com/F5 Dev Central in the repositories that are there. So we'll make sure that we provide a pointer to the people watching as well. So you mentioned this earlier, but yes, NGINX Core project released open source in 2004. So 20-year celebration that's going on here.
Yep.
And we have this huge number of projects that are out there, all through F5, all through NGINX, lots of open source work. But we always like to ask our guests this question: what is your favorite non-NGINX open source project?
It's by far the Linux kernel, might be an obvious answer. I started working with Linux back in 1995, if I remember well. It was kernel 0.99. It didn't support basically almost anything. And that was really amazing because back in the days, I was still young and I managed to find the theory I studied at school, implemented in real code that I could fiddle with and that I could explore and investigate and so on. So that was an amazing learning tool as well, together with being a fun thing to do in my spare time back then.
Yeah, I have to admit, I started with Linux 0.93 back in like 1994, but got really introduced to the power of open source with Samba which was a windowing file system for Unix systems before Linux really came out. But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating how the world has changed around that. So with that, any final thoughts you would like to share with us about how people get involved with open source, how people can get involved with your project?
So I think that working with the open source projects in general means building something with other people because you are part of a loosely connected team. And this leaves an impact that is generated by sharing and cooperating on a common goal out of curiosity or just for fun. And this often matches with people personality outside the context of the open source arena in some way. And open source to me also means to enjoy empowering others by collaborating on something and working on a shared project. Another aspect of the story is that the open source developers in some way provide some unique value, and they subsequently enjoy the recognition that comes with it. So in some sense, an open source developer becomes a kind of influencer for the company they work with, on top of meeting the daily responsibilities. So trying to be creative and come up with ideas and try to put them in practice under the form of whatever type of code it might be. So that's probably the most meaningful things to me.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for coming on with us today. This project actually sounds really fascinating. I've read the blog. I'm going to have to go dig deeper into it and see what else I can bring up and be that influencer as well for this. And thank all of y'all for joining us today for this edition of the NGINX Community Chats. If you've got ideas, feel free to leave them for us in the comments. If you've got questions, feel free to ask them there as well. And as always, may the open source be with you.
Thank you.